"Sir, I need you to step off the vessel." Now the voice carried the flat, clipped authority of a man who had been given a small amount of power very recently and had not yet learned the difference between using it and performing it. Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Trent, 26 years old, stood at the gangway of the Ronald Reagan, with the posture of someone who had been told repeatedly that posture was the first language of command. He was wearing his dress whites. They were immaculate. He had a lanyard, a clipboard, and an audience. A line of civilians waiting behind the rope barrier for the public affairs tour of the carrier, watching the scene unfold with the particular paralysis of people who are embarrassed for everyone involved but have decided not to become involved themselves. The old man he was addressing did not step off the vessel. He was standing at the top of the gangway where the steel deck of the Reagan met the boarding ramp, and he was looking at the flight deck beyond Trent the way a man looks at something he has complicated feelings about. Not nostalgia exactly, not grief exactly, but the particular quality of attention that belongs to people who have unfinished business with a place. He was 83 years old, and his name was Henry Calder, and he was wearing a short-sleeved button-down the color of faded sage, tan slacks with the careful crease of a man who takes his appearance seriously without being vain about it, and a pair of leather boat shoes that were perhaps 15 years old and had been resoled twice. He had no lanyard. He had no documentation visible. He had a canvas bag hanging from one shoulder that contained, among other things, a thermos of coffee, a paperback he was 2/3 through, and a small framed photograph that he had been carrying in various bags and pockets for 51 years without explaining it to anyone who hadn't already known why. "Sir," Trent stepped closer. "This is a restricted vessel. The public tour doesn't begin for another 40 minutes. You need to return to the pier." Henry Calder finally looked at him. His eyes were gray, not the vivid gray of youth, but the particular gray of a winter ocean before a weather system moves through, clouded at the surface, and yet, somehow, inexplicably deep. The depth was the confusing part. It did not match the rest of him, the age-spotted hands, the slight forward lean of a man whose spine had been through too many hard years, the hearing aids tucked discreetly behind each ear. The eyes did not belong to a man who had spent his 80s waiting for things. They belonged to a man who had spent his 20s deciding them. "Son," he said, in a voice like gravel settling, "I'm not on the tour." Trent's jaw set. It was a jaw that had been trained to set, trained at Recruit Training Command Great Lakes, trained across 3 years of sea duty, trained in the particular microculture of a petty officer who has decided that the way you carry yourself on a quarterdeck defines what you are. "Then you're on this vessel without authorization, sir. Which means I need to ask you to." "I served on this class," Henry said. He was not arguing. He was simply providing information, in the tone of a man who believed that accurate information, calmly delivered, should be sufficient. 47 to 53. Different hull, same class. "I know my way around." Trent's expression shifted into something that wanted to be patience, but was actually condescension wearing patience's clothes. He turned slightly toward Seaman Garvey, who was standing 2 steps behind him, and the look that passed between them was the look of 2 people who have arrived at the same conclusion without having to say it aloud. Behind them, from the line of civilians at the rope barrier, someone coughed. Someone else checked their phone. "Sir, I understand you may have served previously, and we appreciate your service." The phrase came out the way it had been delivered to Henry approximately 800 times in the preceding 20 years. Reflexive, formulaic, the linguistic equivalent of a participation ribbon. "But without current credentials, I cannot allow you access to this vessel. If you'd like to rejoin the public tour line, Marcus," Seaman Garvey's voice dropped low. Trent continued, louder now. projecting slightly for the benefit of the civilians at the rope line. A performance, though he would not have called it that. "Sir, you need to step off the gangway. I'm going to need you to step off the gangway right now, or I'm going to have to involve base security, and nobody wants that." He reached forward then. Not a grab, not quite, but the extension of a hand toward Henry's arm that carried the clear intention of physical redirection. Henry looked at the hand. He did not move away from it. He did not flinch. He stood with the absolute stillness of a man who has been in situations, a great many situations, across several decades and several bodies of water that had not been calm, where stillness was the correct and necessary response, and who had trained that stillness so deeply into himself that it had become indistinguishable from his character. "Don't," he said quietly. One word. Not a threat, not a plea. A simple, precise piece of information. Trent's hand closed on his arm anyway. And then, Petty Officer Second Class Marcus Trent, 26 years old, did the thing that tipped the situation from uncomfortable into something else entirely. He walked Henry Calder backward. 2 firm steps, off the top of the gangway and onto the boarding ramp. The sound that moved through the watching civilians was something between a breath and a word. Seaman Garvey had gone very still. Henry steadied himself on the ramp with one hand on the rail. The steel under his palm was warm from the California sun, warm and salt-roughened, textured in the specific way that carrier deck metal weathers, and the feel of it pulled him somewhere else before he had decided to go. The smell of the San Diego pier, diesel and brine, and the warm metal scent of a working flight line dissolved. What replaced it was the smell of salt water and blood, and the particular cold black of the South China Sea at 11 o'clock at night in October 1967, when the water temperature was 71 degrees and felt, to a man who had been in it for 30 minutes, like the inside of a freezer. He was 28 years old. He was treading water 6 miles off the coast of a country that, in the documentation that would eventually be generated about this night, would be described only as a denied area. His mask was gone. His rebreather had taken a fragment from the same burst that had opened his neck, and it was floating somewhere behind him in the dark, useless. He had one hand pressed against the wound and one hand working to keep himself at the surface, and the calculus of this, one hand for the wound, one hand for survival, was the simplest and most absolute mathematics he had ever been asked to do. Behind him, Petty Officer First Class Domingo Rivera was alive, but not swimming. He had been pulled out of the water twice by Henry, and had stopped being able to help with the third attempt. Henry had his collar. Rivera's head was above the water. That was the whole of the objective now. Rivera's head above the water until the extraction boat completed its approach. 40 meters behind Rivera, Seaman Apprentice Lou Kowalski was not above the water, and had not been for 11 minutes. Henry did not look in that direction. He had stopped looking in that direction. There was nothing to be done in that direction, and he had made the calculation that looking cost something he could not spare. He looked instead toward where the boat would come from. He pressed his hand harder against his neck. He kept Rivera's collar in his grip. He waited. The extraction took 43 more minutes. The corpsman who closed his neck on the moving boat in the dark, a 22-year-old from Kalamazoo whose name Henry still knew and still thought about, said afterward that it was the cleanest he'd ever seen a man hold still for that kind of work. Henry had not held still because of bravery or discipline or any virtue he could have named. He had held still because Rivera was lying next to him on the deck of that boat still breathing, and Kowalski was not, and the correct thing, the only possible correct thing, was to hold still. He had been carrying Kowalski's photograph for 51 years. He had come to this ship, and to ships of this class, because Kowalski had served on a Nimitz-class carrier before the transfer that had brought him to the team. Coming here was not grief, and it was not ritual, and it was not anything that Henry had ever been able to put the right word to. It was simply what he did. It was the only form of accounting he had left that felt honest. The warm steel of the gangway rail came back under his palm. The San Diego sun, the smell of diesel and salt. He did not look angry. He looked, if anything, tired in the way that people who have been patient for a very long time eventually look when they have been patient for a moment too long. He shifted the canvas bag on his shoulder, looked back once at the flight deck visible beyond the two petty officers, and then looked at Trent with his gray ocean eyes. "You'll want to remember this morning," he said quietly. "Not the way you're thinking." He turned and began to walk down the ramp toward the pier. The collar of his short-sleeved shirt had shifted when Trent grabbed his arm, and it had not resettled entirely. On the left side of his neck, just above the collarbone, a scar was visible. Not a surgical scar. Not the clean line of a planned incision. Something older and more violent than that. Something that had been made at speed, by something moving very fast, in circumstances that did not allow for precision. It ran from just below his jaw to his collarbone, and it was the whitened, settled color of a wound that had been closed decades ago by hands working in conditions that were not designed for careful work. Seaman Garvey saw it. He had grown up in a household where his grandfather's stories had been the furniture of his childhood, where certain phrases, certain designations, certain theaters of operation had been spoken with the particular weight that families who have sent people to wars attach to the words those people bring back. He had grown up knowing what certain kinds of scars meant. He had grown up knowing that some wounds were made at sea, in the dark, by things that moved very fast, in operations that had never appeared in any newspaper and never would. He looked at the scar. He looked at the way Henry Calder walked, the particular quality of it, deliberate and unhurried and somehow very old and very precise simultaneously. He looked at Trent. He made a decision. "I'll be right back," he said. He walked quickly, not running, but close to it, toward the ship's quarterdeck. The officer of the deck that morning was Lieutenant Commander Patricia Solis, 38 years old, who had a reputation aboard the Reagan for being the kind of officer whose questions, when she asked them, you wanted to have already thought about. When Seaman Garvey appeared at her side and told her in a low, rapid voice what had just happened at the gangway, she was quiet for a moment in the way that people are quiet when they are running a calculation. Then she asked him one question. He gave a name. "Calder, ma'am. Henry Calder." Lieutenant Commander Solis looked at him for a moment with an expression he couldn't entirely read. Then she picked up the handset on the quarterdeck console. She made a call that lasted 40 seconds. On the other end of that call, a chief petty officer with 30 years of service heard the name Henry Calder and put the handset down on his desk very carefully, the way you put something down when your hands have gone slightly unreliable, and picked up a different phone. That call went to a commander. The commander made a call. That call went through 2 more intermediaries, each one responding to the name Henry Calder in a manner that escalated slightly from the one before it to the office of Rear Admiral James Whitmore, Commander, Naval Air Forces Pacific, who was in the middle of a planning session for an exercise that involved 4 carrier groups and the coordination of roughly 22,000 personnel. Admiral Whitmore's aide, a lieutenant named Cho, entered the room, leaned down, and said 3 words into the Admiral's ear. The Admiral was out of his chair before Lieutenant Cho finished the sentence. He said 2 words to the people remaining at the table. Adjourn this. He was through the door before they had time to respond. On the pier below the Reagan's gangway, Henry Calder had found a bollard to sit on and had opened his thermos of coffee. He was watching a pelican work the water 20 feet off the pier with the absorbed attention of a man who has learned that pelicans, given sufficient time, will resolve whatever problem they are working on without assistance. He did not appear to be waiting for anything. He appeared to be simply present, in the way that certain very old people are present, with a quality of patience that is not the patience of someone who expects things to go differently, but the patience of someone who has made peace with the terms. He heard the sound before he saw anything. It was the sound of a lot of people moving quickly through a space that was designed for an organized flow of movement. The particular percussion of urgent boots on steel deck, the rapid exchange of clipped words, the sound of institutional machinery shifting gear without warning. Then the sound changed character. It moved from inside the ship to outside, from the quarterdeck to the gangway, from the gangway to the pier. Admiral James Whitmore came down the gangway at a pace that, for an officer of his age and rank, communicated something specific to every person watching it, that whatever was at the bottom of this gangway required his immediate personal attention, and that the normal pageantry of rank had been suspended in favor of something more direct. He was in service dress blues, his ribbons a dense column of color across his chest, his 4 stripes precise on his sleeves. Behind him came his aide, a flag lieutenant, the chief petty officer who had put down his handset carefully, and 3 other officers who had attached themselves to the movement with the instinct of people who understand that proximity to what happens next is its own kind of information. Trent, who had returned to the gangway, watched the Admiral come down the ramp and felt something happen to his certainty, a slow, specific dissolution, like watching ice become water without being able to identify the exact moment the transition occurred. Admiral Whitmore walked across the pier to the bollard where Henry Calder was sitting with his coffee. He stopped in front of him. He looked at the old man, at the faded sage shirt, at the careful crease in the tan slacks, at the hearing aids, at the canvas bag, at the scar visible at the collar of his shirt. His expression was not the expression of a superior officer encountering an unauthorized civilian. It was the expression of a man encountering someone to whom he owes a debt, and who has just understood that the debt is larger than he had previously accounted for. He came to attention. He saluted, sharp, square, held, and the people assembled at the gangway and on the pier and behind the rope barrier watched a 4-stripe admiral render honors to an 83-year-old man sitting on a bollard with a thermos of coffee. Henry Calder looked at him for a moment. Then he rose, slowly, with the deliberateness of someone who has learned to move carefully and who does not waste the effort, and returned the salute with his right hand, steady as machinery held for 3 full counts. "Admiral," he said. "Mr. Calder," Whitmore lowered his hand. "I owe you an apology on behalf of this command. We'll do better." "No need," Henry said. "Young men don't know what they can't see yet. That's not a character flaw. It's an age." Whitmore turned. He looked at the assembled officers, at Trent standing rigid at the gangway, at the civilians behind the rope barrier who had forgotten entirely why they were there. He spoke clearly, addressing the pier. "This is Henry Calder. He served in the United States Navy from 1958 to 1971. His service record includes 2 tours in the Pacific Fleet, 1 tour in the Atlantic Fleet, and 4 operational deployments to theaters that remain partially classified to this day. He was a member of Underwater Demolition Team 12 and subsequently served in the predecessor unit to what would become Naval Special Warfare, the direct institutional ancestor of the SEALs that operate from this ship. In 1967, during an operation in the Gulf of Tonkin that I am not able to fully describe in this setting, his team was ambushed while conducting a hydrographic reconnaissance. Of the 6 men on that mission, 2 did not return. 2 more were extracted under fire with wounds that ended their service. Henry Calder was extracted last. He stayed in the water for an additional 40 minutes to ensure the extraction of his teammates before accepting rescue himself. The wound on his neck that you can see from where you're standing was made during that 40 minutes. It was closed by a corpsman on a moving boat in the dark, under fire, 6 miles offshore. He has never applied for the additional benefits to which that wound would have entitled him. He has never spoken publicly about what happened that night. He has visited this ship, or ships of this class, 9 times since his retirement, on the anniversary of the operation. Not to be recognized, not to receive anything, because 2 of the men who didn't come home served on a carrier of this class in the years before that operation, and coming here is how he keeps that promise. The pier was very quiet. Whitmore looked at Trent. His voice did not change volume or temperature, but something shifted in it, a quality of precision that was more cutting than any elevation would have been. Petty Officer Trent, you will report to your division officer this afternoon. The rest of this will be handled through proper channels, and it will be handled thoroughly. He turned back to Henry. Mr. Calder, I would like to personally escort you aboard the Reagan, if you'll permit it. You may go wherever you'd like to go. Henry considered this for a moment. Then he said, I'd appreciate that. There's a spot on the fantail. I like to sit there. Then that's where we'll go. Petty Officer Trent's proceedings were completed 3 weeks later. They were thorough, as promised. He was reduced in rate, assigned to mandatory professional development coursework, and given a formal counseling that would remain in his service record for 5 years. He processed all of it in the particular silence of someone who is not yet sure what they think about what has happened to them, but who has understood, at minimum, that they were wrong in a way that mattered. 6 months later, he was sitting in a coffee shop near the base when the door opened, and the man from the gangway walked in. Henry Calder moved to the counter, ordered something, and turned to find a table, and found Trent. Trent stood up. He stood up the way you stand when you are doing something that your pride is fighting you on and you have decided to let your conscience win. Mr. Calder, he said. His voice was quieter than it had been on the gangway. The performance was entirely gone. I don't know if you remember me. I remember you, Henry said. Trent's jaw worked for a moment. I was wrong. What I did, I had no idea who you were, and it still would have been wrong even if you hadn't been, even if none of the rest of it were true. I'm sorry. Henry looked at him for a long moment with those gray ocean eyes. He gestured at the chair across from him. Sit down, he said. I'll buy you a coffee. Trent sat. He was thinner than he'd been on the gangway, the institutional swagger replaced by something quieter and less certain, which was not the same as weakness. It was, in fact, the beginning of something more useful than swagger. Henry set his cup on the table and folded his large, weathered hands around it. You know what your problem was? He said. It was not unkind. You were performing. You were doing the job for the people watching, instead of because the job required it. The day you stop needing a witness is the day you start being worth something. He paused, looking out the window at the street. The men who didn't come back out of that water, they never performed a day in their lives. They just did what needed doing. That's the whole of it. He picked up his coffee. He looked at the young man across from him with something that was not warmth exactly, but was the specific quality of attention that one human being gives another when they have decided, without fanfare, that the other person is worth the trouble of being honest with. You've got a career ahead of you, Henry said. Do it for the right audience. He finished his coffee. He rose slowly, with the deliberate economy of his years, and he picked up his canvas bag, and he walked out into the afternoon. He had a pier to get to before the light changed, and a promise to keep, and that was enough. They are out there still, The men and women who did the things that cannot be spoken of in open settings, who carry the weight of what they did and what they lost without asking anyone to help them carry it. They walk among us quietly. They sit on bollards with coffee and watch pelicans. They visit ships. Some of them push mop buckets. Some of them ask for nothing, because what they were owed was paid a long time ago, in water, in the dark, in the presence of people who did not make it home. They are not looking for recognition. But when recognition finds them anyway, the least we can offer is that it finds them correctly. If you were moved by Henry Calder's story of quiet courage and timeless sacrifice, hit that like button, share this video with someone who needs to see it, and subscribe to Veterans Valor for more stories of America's unassuming heroes. The ones who kept their promises long after anyone stopped counting.